we saw in the pandemic, there's a lot of talk about all these pop-up cycle paths and everything that we saw, but it was the cities that already had plans in place and could accelerate them who could profit most from that development and do things the most quickly. So really, strategies and plans, I think, are key.
Welcome to Smart in the City, the Babel podcast. I am your host, Tamlin Shimizu, and really at Babel, we aim to connect the players in the smart city industry with high quality information and ideas through our platform and services. This podcast is really an extension of this goal and mission to drive the change for a better urban life. And first, a quick announcement from Babel. As a company dedicated to drive the change for a better future, we at Babel express our support for all victims of the Ukrainian-Russian war. To all our listeners, if you're wondering how to best support Ukraine from a foreign country, please visit the following website: supportukrainenow.org. And now on to our episode. And today we have with us a very special guest. Her name is Jill Warren, and she is the CEO of the European Cyclists Federation, otherwise known as ECF. And it's a Brussels-based umbrella federation of the civil society cyclist organizations in Europe. She advocates for more and better cycling as a sustainable and healthy means of transport and leisure. Hi, Jill. How are you doing today?
Hi, Tamlin. Just fine.
Great. Did I get your intro okay? Anything that you want to add to introduce yourself better? All good. Okay, perfect. And I also have another special guest with me actually today as well. She is my colleague, Shannon Masika. She is a smart cities consultant at Babel based in Stuttgart, Germany. Shannon, maybe you can give yourself a little bit more of an introduction as well.
Yeah, sure. So here with Babel, I'm working on multiple projects focused on the improvement of urban mobility around Europe. Some really exciting EU-funded projects and a few others directly with cities. And then in my spare time, I'm also quite an avid bike commuter myself, a self-described cargo bike enthusiast. And I'm very passionate about using my background in public health to create more equitable built environments for all.
Wonderful. So yeah, I have two very big bicyclists with us today. And so we'll get started with a bit of some fun questions. And this is a segment that's called Rapid Fire Questions. And so I will ask you a series of questions, and you'll just both answer one after each other quickly as possible. And at the end, maybe we can give some more explanation, but the idea is to go pretty fast through all the questions. So I will ask the question, and then Shannon, maybe you answer first, and then Jill answers after that, okay? Okay. How many bikes do you own?
Currently 3.
I think I have 7 bikes.
Wonderful. Your favorite bike?
I really like my e-bike right now.
My favorite bike is a bike whose name is Spokeske, and it is a cross bike at my house in Germany.
Oh, wonderful. The bike you would recommend to everyone?
I think probably a step-through cruiser with a basket. You want to be able to carry your stuff and get where you're going easily. Pretty great for flat roads around the city.
I think for everyday biking, I like cross bikes or trekking bikes. They're very versatile.
Cool. And your least favorite bike?
Well, I don't want to pick a least favorite. Maybe my road bike, only because it's been attached to its trainer for too long. It needs to see some outdoor action.
My least favorite bike is, I still have a sentimental attachment to it, so I haven't been able to get rid of it, but it's a bike I bought in the early 90s. It's a trekking bike, but it's quite old in the meantime.
Wonderful. And then, so now we can move on a bit to some background, Jill. I think it would be good to dig in a bit deeper to really what is ECF? What are your main goals and main activities?
So, as you mentioned, ECF is the umbrella organization for around 70 cycling advocacy associations throughout Europe. Our activities and outputs include evidence-based advocacy at the European level and sometimes at the global level. We do research and thought leadership projects to underpin our advocacy, things like our widely cited Benefit of Cycling report or last year's Cyclists Love Trains report that we produced in connection with the European Year of Rail to rate the bike friendliness of cities. We very recently published an analysis of national cycling strategies across Europe, so things like that. We centrally coordinate the Eurovelo long-distance cycle route network, which spans 90,000 kilometers and 17 routes in 42 countries. And we also organize the annual Velo-city conference, which is the premier international planning conference for cycling.
I'm glad you mentioned Velo-city, because I was about to say I was about to give you a plug for Velo-city. So can you can you give a little bit more information about it?
Yes, this year's Velo-city conference will take place June 14th to 17th in Ljubljana. It takes place every year. It brings together about 1,500 cycling enthusiasts in the whole cycling planning ecosystem, whether that's city planners, politicians, service providers, advocates. It really spans the whole spectrum of everybody interested in making our cities better for cycling.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm still hoping I get to go this year. I'm not 100% sure, but I think
go.
I think I will.
Great, Pamela. You have to go.
I know. I really want to go. I just have a lot of other events at the same time, so I have to make some very tough decisions. But Velo-city is definitely on the top of my list. At least some of us will be there. I can't guarantee it will be me though. But yeah, thanks for the little introduction. I think it's really interesting that the work you do, and that's really why we brought you on today, because I think there's a lot of policy that needs to happen, right? Also on one side, and then also behavior change and other things along those lines on that side. So I guess what do you think are the top priorities for active mobility right now?
I think it's making space for active mobility, and it's making it safe. When you ask people, why do you or why don't you cycle, or why don't you cycle more, the number one response given by people is that they don't feel safe enough doing it. So safe and comfortable cycling infrastructure that takes people where they want to go is key to getting more people on bikes. And I think a good question to ask is, would I feel comfortable allowing my, 10 or 12-year-old child to cycle by himself or herself in my city to go to regular places they need to go, like school or football practice or someplace? If the answer to that is no, then there's a lot of work to do in your city.
Good. Yeah. Shannon, do you have anything to add to that?
No, really just to compliment what Jill already said. I think I agree completely. And we're talking a lot about bikes today, with Jill coming obviously from ECF, and both of us obviously being very passionate about the topic and as a form of transport. But this really applies, of course, to pedestrians as well, and thinking about multimodal commuting. So how are you going from bike to bus, bike to pedestrian, and thinking about how we're building cities that are easy enough for people to move around of any age, any mobility, being able to interact in their environment without necessarily needing to use a car.
Yeah, wonderful. And so I touched on this before, but really this on the policy side of things, what needs to happen for people to feel more safe? Jill?
I think that plans and strategies are the best start for something like this. What kind of city do you want to have? What kind of space do you want to make for people? How do you want to make your city livable? And then how are you going to do that? What's it going to cost you? How are you going to prioritize what you need to prioritize to get there? We saw in the pandemic, there's a lot of talk about all these pop-up cycle paths and everything that we saw, but it was the cities that already had plans in place and could accelerate them who could profit most from that development and do things the most quickly. So really, strategies and plans, I think, are key.
And strategies and plans, too, that are not just embedded only in the mobility departments, but really trying to bring in stakeholders across different departments, different officials. And we see some cities with health and all policies approaches where, it's also how you position it, right, to be the priority of what's the most important pressing issue in your city. So being able to, target, other comorbidities by placing active mobility as a priority and showing how it can benefit everyone. Not just, I think, unfortunately, sometimes there's a little bit of discourse where it places cyclists as like an us versus them. And how do we avoid that and really build strategies that are taking everyone into consideration?
Yeah, that's a good point. Also, maybe Jill, do you have any? Do you know any cities where this is done really well? Like, do you have best practices?
Yeah, there's a lot of cities that have made huge strides. And when I say, you have your cities that everybody would name, like Copenhagen or Amsterdam, that have long been doing this very, very well. You've got other, particularly a lot of Dutch or Danish cities, Utrecht in the Netherlands, places like that are really good examples to follow for, kind of best practice. On the other hand, I really like to look at university towns because they by definition are built for a lot of people who don't have cars, who walk, from place to place on campus. And so some of my personal favorite cities in Europe are university cities that are just built for active travel. So I'm sitting here today in Freiburg, Germany, where so I live in Brussels, but I used to live in Freiburg and still spend a lot of time here. That is one of my favorite examples of a city where you can bike just about anywhere, and lots of people do, and it's just very normal. And Münster in Germany, I would say, is another really good example. And these are the kind of cities that really inspire me and show, what we can do more of in other places.
Yeah, those are some good examples. I also know Freiburg quite well, as we're actually not sitting so far apart from each other now, as we're in Stuttgart right now. So, what do you think are really the main challenges behind increasing more active mobility in cities? What's really hindering that process?
There's a lot of answers to that question, but I think an important one is it's hard to change the status quo. If you have spent decades and decades building your city for cars and building more parking spaces and wider streets and more streets, centered around car travel, then it's going to be hard to change tack and do something completely different because somebody's going to get upset. And people are afraid to take parking spaces away, to make driving more expensive or parking more expensive, or anything that they feel might disadvantage the status quo and upset that balance. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, frankly. I've spoken to mayors that say the most controversial thing I do, or the thing that creates the loudest screaming, is when I take away parking spaces.
It's very visual, right? People see it right away and they are used to their comfort level. And I think going back to what you said earlier, Jill, about the safety, sometimes it's not even like actual safety, but just perceived safety. So even if you put in new infrastructure, like does that change anything in their minds? Do they feel safe now immediately? Or is this a built habit that, we have to change our patterns just individually also, about how we think about the way we move around?
So how do we balance that? Like the keeping, the car infrastructure with the active mobility? How do would you say that we, get rid of cars entirely? Are you saying that, what do you advocate for?
Well, we advocate for cycling, so we are not, by definition, anti-car. I think I should make that clear because that doesn't seem realistic either, does it? But how can a lot more cycling and a lot more active mobility coexist with cars when they're needed? I think it does require giving less space to cars, both parked cars that sit idle 95% of the time and take up lots and lots of space. It means providing some disincentives to car travel, but lots of incentives to the active travel and making the space for active travel. So it might be, if I take Brussels as an example, you had a very choked up intersection in the center of town. And some years ago, the residents just started dragging picnic tables out there and kind of blockading it and basically showing what they'd rather have there. And after a while, in connection with the Good Move mobility plan that was introduced there, I mean, I'm simplifying the story here, but basically they turned that whole area into a pedestrian area. And if you see the before and after, there isn't anybody who would want that choking car traffic back at that very complicated intersection. It's so much nicer now. And when you can do a few things like this and show people the before and the after, then they don't want to go back. During the pandemic, some of the things that people saw, this outdoor dining and other ways to use space besides car parking spaces or things. I think when you can show people a different way and they see how it benefits them and how nice it is, that's probably the best way to start to change hearts and minds.
You have anything to add, Shannon?
No, I think I just completely agree. Jill hit it right on the head. And I think part of it's also, making sure, just going back again to like, how is this a priority, not just for the people focused on mobility, but making sure we're also fitting in with the agendas and priorities at a broader level for the city. I think that's also where active mobility is really exciting, because cities have really big climate goals right now, decarbonization targets, and anything we do in this space is only going to help really contribute to those goals. So.
Yeah, I think so too. And I guess there's this also component about, okay, we want to advocate for active mobility. What about people with reduced mobility and things along these lines? How do we make sure that we're not leaving those people behind, do you think, Jill?
Well, I think what do you mean by reduced mobility? I mean, is it people in wheelchairs? Well, much better cycling and walking infrastructure is also very good for people who move about by wheelchairs. It's also good for people, pushing around baby strollers and things like that. That kind of mobility is better for a wider section of people. So I think also there's ways that you can build cycling streets and other things that don't mean that they're 100% car free, that those cars that absolutely need to be there can be, but that they take very much a back seat to the active travel in those areas. There's certainly ways that you can make sure you accommodate people with reduced mobility.
Is Shannon maybe has something else to add there also from your public health background? How do we make sure that we're not leaving people behind in this aspect?
I mean, it all starts, with listening to what people want and need, right? So talking to the people who are experiencing the challenges, navigating their streets, about what they want to see. And I think that's where we're also seeing, that's why it's very important that you're doing stakeholder engagement, not just like a one-time process. You're not only surveying your citizens at the start of a project, at the end, because really anything that, when it comes to developing a city to make it more accessible for all, make active mobility safer and more of a priority. I mean, this is an ongoing process. It doesn't happen overnight. So making sure, how are you engaging along the way to make sure that, as you're doing something to maybe improve accessibility for one group, you're not doing something that's unintentionally, limiting accessibility for another, and making sure you're taking those needs into consideration. And I'm talking, I think, a lot about too, this is in the context also of commuting and thinking of active mobility in that sense, but there's also active mobility for recreation. And there's some pretty cool pilots out there, for instance, around with bike share systems. How can they also provide bikes for, not just our typical standard two-wheelers, but also for users who might be usually using a wheelchair, and how can they now use a bike to also experience their city, even if only just for a fun aspect in the afternoon and not necessarily a point A to point B. So I think we have some cool examples to look to that we'll see hopefully integrated more and more into existing schemes.
What about some bad examples that made me think, really? We don't have to name the cities. We don't have to call anyone out. But do you guys have any, examples where you've seen it done poorly, where it did alienate maybe another group or something along those lines?
I've been in one city that was best intentions for putting in some pilots around a safer protected bike lane. But instead of having a full-time protected bike lane, with stanchions or some other kind of formal barrier there permanently, they were modeling a floating parking system where during the less busy times of the day, cars could be parked in what would normally be a lane of traffic, and thereby those parked cars protecting a cycling lane that was inside, buttered up against the sidewalk. While in theory, it I think could have worked very well. I think the problem was that it wasn't a very well communicated strategy in advance. So as soon as the new parking scheme launched, it was very confusing. I think some people didn't realize that was a parking lane during the day. Other people thought it was still somewhere you could drive, and ultimately it didn't wind up being the great protected bike lane that they hoped it would be through the thoroughfare of the city. And so I think really this was part of it was engagement. Part of it was also just, communication. And I think it was trial and error. I think ultimately the city learned a lot from that experience and was able to improve over time. But, good learning lesson, I think, for any city trying to do something similar.
Yeah, I think there's two things of how not to do it that I would cite as examples. One of them is half-hearted solutions. So instead of the protected bike lane, they draw it was even more than a so-called death strip, you know what I mean, the little dotted lines on the side. It was a little more than that, but it still wasn't a separated or protected bike lane. And I thought to myself, they spent a lot of time and a lot of money. They even consulted with residents on this, and they come up with this. That's got to be the worst compromise of all. Um, I think the second thing I would note is putting in some kind of a test infrastructure or solution or temporary one, and it seems to be going well and it's accepted and people like it, and then going back to what was there before for whatever reason. That usually never works. Then you really upset people.
Yeah, those are good examples. And I guess I would also ask, have you had, just to play devil's advocate a bit, have you had any experiences where you wish that, I guess, you could have more impact, or there's some limitations to what you can do to impact active mobility causes?
Absolutely. I'm always going to have a job, I think, or there's always going to be a role for my organization because you never get everything that you want. It's a process. I think years ago we were considered very much, the fringe or leisure or what everyday cycling. That's something they only do in, I don't know, the Netherlands. Or it's very much more accepted these days, but we still have a ways to go in terms of convincing some of the policy and decision makers that cycling is a fully fledged mode of transport and should be supported and prioritized as such. We're starting to make some very good progress with that notion of prioritization. So the urban mobility framework that came out of the European Commission last December for the first time actually said local and national governments should place a priority on active mobility and public and shared transport. That's huge. And if you compare it to, what they were or weren't saying previously in that sense. And that also is the result of quite a lot of lobbying over the years by us and our allies in public transport and other associations, working for more active and sustainable mobility in our cities. So we still have a way to go. And right now I see the challenge as, okay, let's make sure that money is put where the mouths are. Yes, they've said it's a priority now, but really, are more funds going to be made available for it? Are policies that really ensure that those things happen in a more accelerated way? That's our job now, to keep them, make them stick to their word and put the money where the mouth is.
You beat me to that phrase, Jill. I was thinking that as you were talking. Also, because I know just myself this week, I've seen a few upcoming Horizon calls, for instance, that are focused solely on active mobility. So it is really good to see money being put where the mouth is on that. And I think also exciting because those funding schemes, that not only is it going to be countries taking their national funds or regional funds and working within their own locations and geographies, but now also collaborating and figuring out how cycling doesn't end at borders, active mobility doesn't end at borders. So how do we better cooperate, and how do we use this money strategically to benefit really beyond just one locale?
Yeah, very nice. And so, Jill, also, if so for the city representatives listening right now, how would they come to work with you? What can they get out of it?
Well, we do have a network called the Cities and Regions for Cyclists Network. And that's very much a forum where cities can share best practice. They can hear from other cities. They can more easily get in touch with cities who have maybe done something that they're considering, or get some feedback and contacts and be able to do that networking. So that's one way that we work with cities. We also work with them in the context of projects, many of them EU funded, that we work on, where things will be piloted in cities or tried out. So that's another way that we get directly involved with cities. And then, of course, things like the Velo-city conference, which is the knowledge sharing platform for what cities are doing in the area of cycling. We have I think in total, something like 200 speakers across all the different sessions, and quite a lot of them are from cities. So people can come there to learn from their peers in other cities, what's working, what's not working. How can I get some inspiration for what I might do in my city?
If a company is listening, is that also what you would recommend, that they attend Velo-city, or how would you recommend that a bike sharing company, for instance, gets involved with you?
Well, absolutely, because we have people from 60 different countries, and lots of them represent cities or have to do with urban mobility and promoting active mobility and cycling in their cities. That's a very good way for companies looking to market or sell their products into cities to be able to make new contacts, and also to hear about what's going on in all the different places. It is where all of this comes together. So I think companies can also really benefit from something like that.
Yeah, cool. And now I will ask both of you this question, and this is a question that we ask every single guest, and it's very, very interesting to hear everyone's different responses. We'll start with you, Jill. To you, what is a smart city?
For me, a smart city is a city that is smart enough to make space for people. And a smart city for me is a city that people who don't live there envy, because they see that that city is doing those things better than their own city or better than other places that they've been. And so there's maybe no one right answer, but I think it's cities that are envied for just how much people want to live there and be a part of it.
That's a wonderful answer. And Shannon?
So for me, a smart city is a connected city, but not just in terms of technology. That's often where I think the definition stops. But really in terms of how are we connecting people to places, people to each other, cities to other cities, which I know is a big part of the work you do as well, Jill. And how are we making sure that we're doing that in an inclusive way that's not only focusing on the people or the organizations, institutions who would traditionally engage, but really making sure that we're also focusing on those who might not have that empowerment normally.
Wonderful. Both really great answers. It's really interesting to me to always hear the focus and the priorities different groups of people put on various different aspects of a smart city, but always very important aspects. I wouldn't say equally, but I think the main thing for me is pretty much what Jill said also, is that it focuses on the people and making space for people, and connectivity is a big part of that as well. So yeah, wonderful. So is there any kind of topic, I guess, Jill, that you would like to express more of that we didn't get to today? Any kind of thoughts that you think are really important that I didn't touch on?
I think if I could say one thing, it's that I think mobility in all its forms really needs to be inclusive and accessible and affordable. And for me, that's why active travel is such a big part of that, because it is the cheapest form of mobility that we have. And you get so much back for every euro you invest in that. And I really wish that some of these calculations would flow into cities thinking a lot more about what kind of city do I want? What does it really cost me beyond the pure kind of infrastructure or engineering work that I have to do?
Yeah, especially with those rising gas prices.
Yes, cycling is absolutely a way to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels.
Yeah, yeah, it's becoming more and more important. And actually, I think we're seeing a forced switch in some ways of people moving to more active mobility right now because they can't afford gas prices. I'm not sure if this was the right way to go about it or the preferred way of pushing that change, but definitely seeing more and more action towards that. So, yeah, thank you so much, Jill. For coming on today. We really appreciate your opinions and your thoughts, and really appreciate also the actions and support that ECF gives to cities and to anyone really in this space. So, yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. And to all of our listeners, if you want to learn more about projects and real life implementations in smart cities in Europe and beyond, you can find more information on babel-smartcities.eu and be part of our community by signing up for free. Thank you all for listening. I'll see you at the next stop on the journey to a better urban life.
Of course, we got to go on a field trip. How cool is this?
If you work in bikes, I guess working's always a fun day.
Well, it usually is, but some days are more fun than others.
Yes. We can understand that.